Welcome to History 2020. I'm Dr. Sawyer. I'll be your professor for today and hopefully for the rest of the semester. And oh, what a semester it's been already. I feel like these classes are strong and I really appreciate it. All right, well, today in class, just want to go back over some things to start off and then we'll get moving into the material from the period that we're talking about here. The last few lectures, we talked about the Constitution, set the stage for these lectures, talked about the context, the end of the Civil War, and the period of Reconstruction. And when we last left off, we discussed the move to reunite the country and how that itself actually ends up pushing the country west. And that's not the only thing. Several things actually do that, and we'll get into that more in this class. Let's go through here and just review. I'm going to give you guys a couple of updates on the class first. Just a reminder that this next week, so it will be week 3, in your section you will have a Constitution quiz. And what will that be? A test on the amendments 1 through 15 and the Constitution itself. And just a reminder, the quiz will be on the Constitution as it stood in 1877. I said that a couple times, but it seems like some people still tend to miss that. That is essential because we are not looking at the Constitution as it stands today. We are looking at it as of 1877. And the reason I do that is, a couple of reasons. First of all, I want you to know what rights don't exist at the time that you have right now. We take a lot of things for granted. Some of the amendments that get put in place between then and now allow us to actually directly elect senators and allow women to be guaranteed the right to vote. Sure that people who are 18 and older can give them the right to vote. Can't be denied on the basis of age there if you're 18 or over. These are big changes. As we'll discuss, the issue of voting originally, we've already mentioned this a bit actually, originally left to the states to decide that. And gradually the federal government comes to ensure more and more of the rights to vote and citizenship. So, we'll get to this, but it's not that women don't have the right to vote before. It's not that the Constitution says women can't vote. It's that the Constitution doesn't say they can. So states can make their own decisions on it. In some states, by the time you get the 19th Amendment in 1920, which gives women the right to vote, some states have already decided to allow women to vote. But this means that the states can't say no to women on the basis of their sex. So it's a good thing, I think. Always somebody who's like, I don't know, man. I'm not so sure. Oh, God bless you. God bless you. I'm pretty sure that I'm the one who should be making the decisions around here. Man, that's a statement. That's a statement. Anyway, so that's coming up. Make sure you're prepared for that and check the calendar for the study sessions. If you're watching this on Wednesday night, guess what? If you're watching at 8 p.m., you could be at the study session that I'm running tonight at 8 p.m. So just thought there's some on Thursday, some on Friday, and we can try to line some up for the morning next week on Monday and Tuesday. So we'll let you know about that. Also, this lecture and the next one, so lecture 4, there's no quiz this week because I'm not really into subjecting you guys to intense quizzing and examining when I don't have to. So since we've got that Constitution quiz coming up in week 3, there's no quiz for week 2, just to give you guys a chance to study for that. It's also my way of saying this is really important. Read the Constitution. It's good to know. And I don't think I've said this before in this class, but I usually do. I just want to repeat this. People do not tell you what your rights are when they are taking them away from you. They assume that you won't know. We've talked about this a lot. This is the theme of the class. That if you don't do your own work and you don't know your rights and you don't know the story, people can take them away without letting you even know they're there. So know your rights. It's important. So these lectures here, since there's not a quiz this week, the content covered in this lecture and in lecture 4 will be on the quiz next week that's due at the end of next week. So make sure you take good notes on this, and all this stuff, of course, will be on the midterm and final exam. The final exam will be cumulative. So there we go. Enough talking about the test there. Let's move on to history. Let's review here. Okay, so last time we talked about the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction, the promise of a new America. For a minute, it looks like we're going to see Black Americans included, and they are, in a way they hadn't been before. Certainly not that there aren't still a lot of barriers. But by the end of the 1870s, you see that the country had turned its attention away from ensuring civil rights. And with the return of the Southern Democrats, with the admission of Georgia as the last of the Confederate states to join back, you see the Southern Democrats once again being a powerful force on national politics, and the conversation turns away. Where we left off last was with the Compromise of 1877. We'll get to that here in a second, but I want to recap here. I want to talk about some of these big questions I want you guys to be thinking about as we go on in this class. I mentioned this before, but I really want to drive this home because these are some of the through lines that are going to connect the lectures and help you make sense of it. So first of all, how does the United States transform from a fractured agricultural country in the 1870s to the world's most powerful country by the end of the 20th century? And how and why does this affect the United States' role in the world? It's not until after World War II that we have a standing army like we have now. Prior to this, you had the militias at the state level. You had some federal officers and federal troops that were permanently appointed. But by and large, you didn't have a standing army until you needed one. While there were huge draft efforts in World War I and World War II, those efforts build massive armies. But after World War II, the United States decides to keep that army standing all the time. That's a huge break with the past. The founders would have been a little suspicious of this. Why would we have constantly a standing army? Well, everything has everything to do with the United States and its new role in the world after World War II. Why do they decide that that's appropriate? That's a question to ask. Why do American citizens experience improvements in their lives? They do. Unquestionably. The opportunity to go to college is something. It's by largely a government effort. Didn't have to happen. Why do we have a world where we're not really worried about starving to death anytime soon? I mean, that is, and I want to drive home, that is a difference between most of humanity prior to the modern era. So how do we get economic improvements and how do we get civic improvements? Why is it that Americans decide to enshrine the right to vote for women into the Constitution when they hadn't before? Why do they decide that 18 years old is an appropriate age when they hadn't done that before? There are reasons. People make decisions. Country has evolved. It's changed. We take it for granted, but at some point, someone had to decide to make that change. Why? We'll get to that. And another one is, who are the winners and losers from all of this? It's unquestionable that life overall improves. But as you'll see, the benefits are not equally distributed. Who wins out? Who loses? Who's on the front lines to receive the benefits of this new wealth? And why is it that the surge in wealth that the United States sees in the 20th century is distributed at all? We don't ask this question enough. We look at things like the Dow Jones Industrial Average and GDP and all these things as indicators of our economic health. But those things alone are not beneficial to everyone. If I'm in a classroom of there's 30 people in there and our GDP per capita is $1 million per person, you'd be like, dang, it's a pretty rich place. But if I've got $30 million and you guys ain't got nothing, it's a pretty poor gauge of how we're all doing in there, isn't it? The Dow Jones goes up, y'all don't own any stock. Not exactly a good gauge of how we're benefiting. The reality is that something does happen where that wealth does get distributed to people. Again, not equally, but people's lives get a lot better. It doesn't just happen because money is there. It happens because we make decisions about the way we think it's fair to see that the places we see the places that we think it's fair for that money to go. And that changes over time as well. I want you to think about this throughout the semester. Because if you look at these things as just things that happen, things to memorize, they're not going to do you any good. What's going to do you good and what's going to be helpful is if you think about the ways, the events, sentiments, all the things that are behind the decisions that actually give us this life that we have, that is pretty damn good. And when you think about those decisions, you think about who was left out of it, I think you'll be surprised to look around you and understand the disparity that exists. Just as the decisions were made that benefited some people, I think you'll be surprised to find out how many decisions were specifically made to deny some people those benefits. And if you understand that the decisions are behind it, understand we can make the decision to do it other ways. What that decision is up to you, but I want you to be able to think about it and understand where it comes from. And I want you to remember that throughout this class, we did this experiment in class the other day where I asked you guys, we're all in a shoe factory. What are the possible changes if we have a machine that comes in and doubles our productivity? Got a lot of different answers on that. And as I said, at any point in time, they're the questions we ask, the questions we know better than to ask, and in between is that valley filled with questions we don't even think to ask. What the questions on any part of that map are is dependent on our time. Understand that and think about that when you're looking at folks that we study in the class. Cool? All right, let's go on. Now, we last left off on this kind of heartbreaking moment in 1877 called the Compromise of 1877, where the Republicans, in order to get their guy Rutherford B. Hayes in the presidency without too much of a fight from the Democrats, there's a compromise struck in which the two big factors, and there's more to it than this, but the two big factors were, number one, the end of the federal commitment to overseeing civil rights in the South, essentially the removal of these eyes and ears of the federal government down there, which, as I said, no witness, no crime. Allows the southern states to get back to what they see as, well, not they, of course. Remember, the majority of the people in many of these states are not white people. But by and large, the old Confederate elite, which has returned to power, has decided is the appropriate order of things. This includes using the state and using violence to ensure white supremacy. So we left that there, and the one thing that I left off on was there was always this question of how do you heal? How do you find common ground again? How do you get past the 4 years of brutal fighting that went on between these states and create some idea of a unified vision for the country? And what I left you with is, by and large, the answer. At least I find to be the most convincing answer. There are several factors, but the most convincing one, argued, I believe, first by Heather Cox Richardson in a book called West of Appomattox, is that Americans began focusing less on the conflict between the North and the South and more on their unified vision of the West. It is a place that is going to change the way the country thinks about itself. And also, instead of thinking about North versus South, former Confederate soldiers and Union soldiers are going to fight together in the wars to remove the Native Americans from their land. That is going to give a common enemy and a common cause that helps bring the country, or at least the non-native people of the country, into a common effort. Now, to understand this, you've got to understand technology and the big developments that have happened in the country leading up to this. The country, and one of the arguments I'll put forward in this lecture, and I think I'll be backing up with the evidence here, is this argument that a lot of Americans have, and you guys might have heard this, and just you guys who are in the room, have you ever heard people say the government didn't used to get involved in people's lives, and now the government has vastly overreached its steps? The government needs to be small again like it used to be. You guys heard that before? I've heard that argument. It's a very convenient silence around all of these events prior to this. Yeah, the government didn't used to provide health insurance, didn't used to provide, still doesn't provide health insurance, didn't used to provide pension for Social Security so people could retire. Sure, didn't used to tax as much on income. That's all true. But there's plenty of ways the federal government was involved in Americans' lives. And a big one would have to be with the federal government overseeing the vast expansion of the country west, which involves lots of federal spending, both on buying land, and, we talk about the Louisiana Purchase. We bought the land from France, which is fascinating because the French, by and large, only lived around New Orleans. Most of what we purchased in 1803 was the right to take the land from the natives who lived there without the French going to war with us. We began sending the U.S. Army out west to clear the land, and the federal government sells it off to settlers out there for pretty cheap. Remember, winners and losers. So you've got that. You've also got the fact that, people say a lot that, this country didn't used to be in debt, and now we've run ourselves in debt. And don't get me wrong, we have run ourselves in a lot of debt. But the idea that this is a new thing is a bit silly. Just look at the evidence. This country has been in debt for all but about 18 months of its entire history. As we talked about earlier, the Constitution was written 1787, and one of the principal problems on the mind of the people who wrote it was the inability to pay off the debt they had amassed during the Revolutionary War. One of the sources of this debt early on is that we decide to borrow a lot of money to buy this Louisiana territory. So, interestingly enough, a lot of it from British bankers. This is 1803. This is like being separated finally after a long, brutal relationship, marrying the person you love, and then going and asking your ex-husband to borrow some money so that you can get a house. It's kind of an interesting story. It's like, well, you want to borrow money from them? It seems like there might be some strings still there. Second wave here, and this is on the map here on the slide. Second wave we have that brings in a lot more land is the Mexican-American War, which can go back to the Texas Revolution of the 1830s, in which Americans decided to settle in Texas and then decided that Texas was theirs. Caused a bit of a rift, and later on in the 1840s, thanks to President James K. Polk and those who support him, not only Texas, but a whole swath of the western lands in the American Southwest is taken. Here's a quick version of that story. What you got to also get about this is the reason, one of the primary causes for the desire for this is that the land that they're trying to annex here is really good for growing cotton. Polk is a Tennessean. His lot of two out of three of the soldiers that fight in the Mexican-American War are Southerners. It's going to open up a whole lot more land for cotton farming to bring that into the United States, which is going to mean the expansion of the plantation, which, as I told you, expansion is at the heart of the slave owner's interest because it has to expand under its current form to survive and thrive. Here's a rough version of this. So, the United States is like, hey, Mexico, sell us that land. And Mexico's like, no, we're good. Not for sale. They're like, but you're not even using it. Mexico's like, nah, we're good. Prior to this, and this request to buy this in the 1830s and 1840s, these Americans had moved into the Mexican state of Texas, set up. Mexico banned slavery, and the Texans start not abiding by the law at all. They're like, nah, we got slavery here. We're not going to stop our slavery. So, in the 1830s, because these Americans who were settling in the northern part of Mexico refused to abide by Mexican law, Mexico closes the border to American immigration. They ban it. No more Americans crossing this border. But the Americans don't listen, and they continue to cross the border illegally, and the Americans continue to come in and continue breaking the law by practicing slavery. Let me repeat that. Mexico banned immigration from the United States. And the Americans did not listen, continued illegally crossing the border and breaking the law. So hard to learn these things sometimes. Gotta swallow a little bit of that indignity maybe you had. So, the Texans, when the Mexicans actually try to force the Texans to abide by the law, the Texans rise up in a revolution, declare independence. You guys know this story if you've met anybody from Texas. They always talk about it. Oh, we used to be a republic. We used to be, so we could be a republic again. They act like we're begging them to join. It's amazing. They act like, we could leave this club if we wanted to. We're pretty special. That's a pretty amazing story, too, when you consider that when the Texans declared independence, they immediately were like, all right, we can be a part of the United States now, right? And Andrew Jackson and most members of Congress were like, no, we're good. Because Mexico didn't actually agree that Texas was independent. The Texans just said it. They had a lot of guns, so the Mexicans couldn't do much about it. So Jackson was like, nah, I think you guys got a little bit too much baggage. Also, we bring in Texas, we're going to start fighting about slavery again. I know that. And we had this lunatic named John C. Calhoun who was just talking about trying to annul federal law. So we're gonna put the lid on this right now. So Texas was like, well, okay, well, we wanted to be independent anyway. We're fine. We're happy with this. And they had the Republic of Texas, which a lot of Texans will tell you, we used to be a republic like it's special. Like Vermont didn't used to be a republic or anything, or like California didn't used to be a republic, or Hawaii didn't used to be a republic. A lot of states used to be republics. I mean, hell, we had one called the Republic of Franklin. You guys may recall that. The Hill people, they broke away early on. It didn't quite work out for them, but later on it did. Tennessee. So, after this, Guy Polk gets elected. He decides it's time to annex all this land. We've been trying to buy it from him. Mexico's like, not for sale. Not for sale. So, you know how we are as Americans, guys. Right? You know how we are? Like, we never start wars. We don't do that. Usually we fight to protect things and defend liberty and all that. We would never just spark a war. That presents a problem sometimes, because if you have people that run the government that really want something, but we can't just attack them. So we moved our army into Texas, which from Mexico's perspective, and this is in 1846, from Mexico's perspective, that's just like you moved your army into our country. Just because those rebels up there said it was theirs doesn't mean that we recognize that. We moved it right down to the border with Mexico. Well, inside of Mexico, but what the Texans said was theirs. Moved the army down there, because that's not a problem. If Canada started amassing their soldiers, like, I don't know, inside of Michigan because they claimed that Michigan was theirs, that's probably a bad example. You guys would be like, let them have it. All right, let's say they claimed that Tennessee was theirs and they moved their army inside. You'd be like, huh. Well, then eventually the U.S. pushes the army further into territory that had never really been claimed as a part of Texas, even within Mexico. And once they now have invaded, by almost anyone's accounts, Mexico, there's a skirmish with some Mexican troops. And of course, the United States is like, oh, we were attacked for no reason. And you know how Americans are. We're like, whoa, we were attacked. Get that war spirit whipped up. We invade Mexico and hold down all this land that is now California, New Mexico, Arizona. We hold it down, and we're like, now you're definitely going to sell it to us, right? Because we took it. And Mexico's like, no, just because you're occupying it doesn't mean we're going to sell it to you. And President James K. Polk's like, oh, okay, fine then. And we invade Mexico City, occupy the city, and during a military occupation of Mexico City, we get the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gives us about somewhere between a third and a half of Mexico's entire country at gunpoint. If you guys know the Marine Corps fight song, right? The Marine Corps song. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. The halls of Montezuma refers to the invasion of Mexico during the Mexican-American War. The shores of Tripoli part, that's the Barbary Pirates. It was a weird war. Take History 2010, I'll tell you about it. North African pirates. So, that settles that. Well, it does. It's actually a shotgun treaty because the guy negotiating it for the United States gets wind that Polk might actually want to annex all of Mexico. So he gets this treaty signed pretty quickly to make that not happen. Why would he want all of Mexico? Lots of places to expand slavery. So that settles that. So if you think about this, and this essentially pushes the U.S. continental borders all the way out to the West Coast. One small exception, Gadsden Purchase in 1853. Now, does that sound like limited government intervention in Americans' lives? Spending massive amounts of money to acquire one area, then using the U.S. Army to clear it for settlement, and then using the U.S. Army to send to essentially force the Mexicans to sell the land. That's pretty clear intervention in people's lives as far as I can tell. Now, again, I'm not telling you at all how to feel about things right now. Just don't tell the story with those silences in it, because it's going to be wrong. 1867, the United States purchases Alaska from Russia. That's a weird deal. The Russians had come across and claimed that. Again, we don't purchase the land from the people who live there. We purchase it from another empire that might give us trouble if we tried to take it. It's called Seward's Folly. People make fun of William Seward, the Secretary of State who negotiates that. They're like, you just bought a bunch of ice. Turns out there's a lot of oil under that ice. Lots of resources. So later on, Seward's Folly is kind of said tongue-in-cheek. So here's all this land. From 13 colonies to a transcontinental establishment. Now you're talking about going up all the way into the Arctic. But the thing is, when the United States acquires all of this land, there's really not much of a way or a reason to settle somewhere in the middle of it. Because American cities evolve along with the technology of the time, and this is all shaped by nature. So if you think about the early settlement of the United States, think about the old cities, the colonial cities. The first cities in the United States are all on the East Coast. Boston, New York, Charleston, Philadelphia, Providence, all on the Atlantic Ocean. This makes sense, because that's the places you can actually have a colony and get into the world market. Those are the places where you can move quickly from place to place. And if you think about the cities that are on the East Coast, you can see a huge difference in the way that plantation slavery develops an economy versus something more akin to a market. Because where are all the biggest cities on the East Coast? They're not in the South. Charleston's a pretty small city. Huge cities are New York, Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia. It's because when you don't actually have a group of people that can buy things because they're considered human property, you don't have much of a market for anything. You don't have much of a market for anything. There's not much reason to develop infrastructure. There's not much reason to develop different types of skill sets, educational institutions, things like that. Northern cities become thriving ports. Things come in and out, as opposed to a plantation economy where things, mostly one thing goes out and things come in for a very small group of people to buy. So you've got that. And as Americans move inward in this period, where do they settle? They settle on rivers. Look at the kind of the second wave of American cities. They're on rivers. Nashville, on the Cumberland River. Memphis, on the Mississippi River. All these cities, St. Louis, Kansas City. These cities inland, they're on waterways, because waterways are what you need to transport goods. If you want to grow goods and you want to get them to market, you're not going to walk. Can you have a mule pull it? Especially once you get past the Appalachian Mountains. You've got to be somewhere on the river. So when you're on the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountains, you need riverways that go out to the Atlantic. But when you're on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains, and this part of the country we're in right now, you need access to the Mississippi River, which is another reason that Louisiana Purchase was such a big deal, because once we controlled New Orleans, it meant that we didn't have to worry about the French getting mad at us and shutting off our entire access to global trade. So all these river cities. Now, I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina. You guys been to Charlotte, North Carolina? Anybody been to Charlotte, North Carolina? Oh my God, it is where, I'm from outside of there, but I lived there during college and for a little bit afterwards. I love that city because it's where I'm from, but boy, there ain't a whole lot of soul in that city. Not a whole lot of soul. Fascinating history. But I remember when I grew up, that was the city that I went to. Sometimes we'd go down to Atlanta if we were feeling real big. You know, we'd go sit in those $2 seats in Fulton County Stadium back in the day, where you were likely to get rabies from the wires that were sticking out of everything, which isn't even something that can happen. It was a magical place. Yeah, we're 2 stadiums removed from that place, but you could get $2 seats to sit in the upper deck, and that's where my people sit, up there. The Braves were real bad too. There was a lot of empty seats down the bottom. We were just sitting up there. I was all excited, you know. But the thing that got me, because those are the cities that I knew growing up, was then I went, where did I go? Was it Kansas City I went? I think it was Kansas City. And I was like, dude, there's a river running through this city. This is awesome. How cool is it that there's a river here? Then I went to St. Louis and I was like, oh man, another river. This makes cities so cool. And then I went to like every other city and was like, there's water in every single one of these places. Just so happens that my selective experience had made that a novelty when in fact that's almost every other city. So why are Charlotte and Atlanta cities? They're cities because of the railroad. The railroad vastly transforms where people can live. And it transforms where people meet. It means that no longer are rivers and waterways required for you to actually have a thriving point of trade. Charlotte could have been anywhere. There's nothing special about Charlotte except for that 2 railroads cross there. One railroad ran out to Wilmington, the other one went from north to south. Atlanta turns out to be where it is because if you look at the map here, and I'll do it over here if you guys can see this. Nature has a huge impact on us in ways we don't even think it does. It's less obvious to us now, I think, in a lot of ways than it was then, because one of the big barriers and one of the things that had made Americans really doubtful about whether or not this country could keep going west early on. So in fact, so many people were doubtful of expanding past the Appalachian Mountains that George Washington, in his farewell address, encouraged Americans to believe that they could be a country that transcended this barrier. It's the Appalachian Mountains. They run all the way up here down, and they explain so much about American history. So many things that when we don't think about this as a distinct region and a physical barrier, we lose things. Case in point, people who say the Civil War wasn't about slavery need to look at what happens in Appalachia during the Civil War. Because even in the southern states that support the Confederacy, the Appalachian regions are, by and large, thoroughly against the war. Why? Because you can't have plantations in the mountains. In fact, it's so important that in 1863, the entire western part of Virginia separates from the state of Virginia and claims independence. That's where West Virginia comes from, the middle of the Civil War. Those people knew what it was about. Look at what happens in East Tennessee. They're on the border of actually doing the same thing. But what it explains here in terms of where people can settle and why Atlanta is where it is the Appalachian Mountains prevent you from building a railroad from east to west because they're huge and they are a massive barrier, and getting a railroad line through those mountains is not really feasible. So if you're trying to connect this eastern coast down here further west, you go as far south as you can go and you hit a point and you go, okay, this is the point where we can cut west and not hit the Appalachian Mountains. And that's Atlanta. And it helps Atlanta that there's also an ability to cut through the Appalachian Mountains up near Chattanooga, which allows you to connect into Tennessee. And that's why Atlanta becomes a thriving city. It's the railroads. These are these new South cities, and they are by and large products of the developments that come into place in the mid to late 19th century. Birmingham is another one. Birmingham is where it is because there was a lot of coal near there. You need it for processing iron. So, put a railroad track through there to get the supplies out, and boom, you get a city. These cities are interesting, but they would not have been there if it's not for the railroad. Where we live is affected by our transportation and technology. On top of that, you also have canals. This is a part of this second wave. The Erie Canal, which connects the Great Lakes out to New York City, which ends up making New York City the most powerful city in the country. It surpasses Philadelphia largely because of the traffic that comes into that city because of the Erie Canal. The Great Lakes, they themselves are their own ecosystem. And once they're tied into the Atlantic world through this canal, more people can live there. More people do live there. And you get this point where you have all these cities on the Great Lakes begin to boom, principally Chicago. Think about all the cities on the Great Lakes. Chicago, Cleveland, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, pretty much anywhere there's a bad NFL team. There you go. Thank you, Erie Canal, for giving us the Buffalo Bills.
We hate on the Bills. They had a great season.
Oh, yeah, they did. So do you think they're going to win the Super Bowl?
No.
Yeah, me either, because they're not there. And even when they get there, let me tell you something. Even when they get there, they lose over and over and over again. I haven't been watching football at all this year, but I've got a tradition. I got to revive it. I haven't done it the last couple of years, but I got to do it. I have a Thurman Thomas. If you guys don't know Thurman Thomas was the running back for those Bills teams that went to the Super Bowl over and over and over again and always lost. And what I do is before the Super Bowl, I take that figure. It's like a starting lineup figure that I had as a kid. Still got it for some reason. But I put it in front of the TV and I point it in one direction. And whichever team gets the ball going in that direction, I assume is going to lose. It's my sad compass. Poor Thurman Thomas. Amazing running back. Just couldn't pull it off. Anyway. Sorry, I also forgot to mention Green Bay in there. I don't want to hear it from you guys. But they did. They almost did. Sure. Cool. They're in the Super Bowl. You know who else is not in the Super Bowl? MTSU. All right, cool. So we're all in that same category. So, which is sad because I bet money they were going to win it this year. If they had, I'd be rich. So this is where we're at. The railroads determine where people can live. They change where people can move. They bring places that could previously not be part of this American economy into the economy. But when you end up expanding your borders all the way to the Pacific, and you don't have a railroad line, you're not going to get a whole lot of people who decide to up and live in the middle of all of that. Because as of the outbreak of the Civil War, the fastest way to get from San Francisco, which San Francisco had been established as a dominant city, really the first American city on the Pacific coast. And it thrives because of the gold rush. Even though most people don't find gold, it brings people from all over the world there. It establishes San Francisco Bay as on the map of places to go. It brings in Chinese immigration, which should make sense to you because European immigration is coming from the Atlantic because on the other side of the Atlantic is Europe. On the other hand, Asian immigration begins to build in the San Francisco Bay because that's on the other side there. And there's opportunities for people. They move there. But people come from all over the world. And even if they don't find gold, it puts the city on the map. And it becomes the first presence the United States has there. But it's completely isolated from the rest of the country. Because at this time, in the 1860s, even at the time of annexation in 1848, in the time of the gold rush, there is not a train that goes across the country. And there's not a Panama Canal yet either. Which means that the way that you get from New York to San Francisco involves getting on a boat in New York, taking a boat down to Nicaragua in Central America. Naturally, Nicaragua has a connection of waterways that leads from the Atlantic into a place called Lago de Nicaragua. It's a brackish lake on the western side. And then there's not a continuous connection, but there is a small isthmus of land between Lago de Nicaragua and the Pacific coast where you get out of the boats, you transfer your goods. You essentially have to transport through Nicaragua at that point. And then you get on a boat on the other side of Nicaragua and go up to San Francisco. It's not real fast. And anytime you've got to load and unload products like that to get them from one place to the other, the cost of transportation is going to be a lot higher. It's one of the reasons they're already, at this time, starting to look for a place to build a canal all the way through there, too. We'll get there. This also means that you're dealing with diseases if you go through there because it's a totally different climate. But that's the path you have to go. And a lot of people do it. But it doesn't facilitate the types of connections that you'd have if you never left the country. So they start talking about building a railway across the country. And there's fights over it. In fact, that little sliver I told you about, the Gadsden Purchase, that was negotiated by a senator named Jefferson Davis. You may know him also as the president of the Confederacy. Prior to that, he had been in Congress as a senator from Mississippi, and he had negotiated that deal as a part of an attempt for the Southerners to get a transcontinental railroad built down to New Orleans. Because everyone knows wherever this railroad connects across the country into the Eastern Hub is going to be wealthy from it. Now, the third phase, which we'll get to of this development, is going to be automobiles, which is going to incredibly change the way we can live because it means more people in the interstate structure in particular. I mentioned this in one of my sections before, but if you want to understand why there really aren't sports cars until you get to the 1960s, like mass-produced ones, like the Mustang and the Camaro, not like no, we're not talking Corvette level sports cars. We're talking about mass-produced ones that most people can afford. It has everything to do with the expansion of the interstate. When suddenly being able to go that fast is actually has some benefit to it. So all these technologies shape where we can live, and they're all shaped by nature. And here we go. If you want to see this, if you look at this map right here, 1860, this is the number of railroads. Notice the South, incredibly undeveloped. The South actually not only has far fewer miles of railway, they also don't coordinate like northern states do. So like one state will have railroads that are one gauge, another one will have a different gauge, which means that even if you have railroads that are near each other, you can't just roll one from one track to the other one. You have to actually change the wheels on the train or unload it. So this is 1860. On the left is 1870. They did it. 1869, Congress completes the Transcontinental Railway. And you see where it goes. It goes to the San Francisco Bay. So this connects the country. And you can see by 1890, look at that. If you are someone who wants to grow and wants to be able to buy things, you need to have some way to get those things, the things that you produce, out to sale. You need to have a way to get the goods you need. Every place that a railroad goes means that you can live near that track and you can be a part of that. You're no longer relying on the waterways. The technology of railroads, by the way, the track. A lot of people think about the track and the actual train as the same thing. It's not. The track is a solution to the problem of reliable transportation, right? Because dirt roads wash out. So you build a road that's raised up off the ground, driven into the ground, doesn't wash out when it's rain. You can go across it regardless, which you need whenever you have factories, because factories don't produce by the season like farmers do. Then the train, what goes on, it's another technology. History 2010, we talked about that. Right, did you have a question?
Just out of curiosity, looking at the map from 1880, how many of those tracks do like Illinois, Ohio, and like the upper Midwest are actually still in use?
I'm not sure, but a lot of them are still in use, like the
Okay.
routes. Um, if you've ever been to Europe, you know this. Like in Europe, people travel on rails all the time. It's actually pretty convenient, in my experience anyway. But they're also much smaller countries, and the cities are closer to each other, right? So there's difference in that. But one of the things is that in the United States, we're like, well, we don't have any trains here. Why don't we have any trains? It's not that we don't have trains. We have tons of trains. We just don't have commuter trains. So like
Is there a reason?
is there a reason? Well, there's different reasons for it. Um,
But like a historical one, because like England did it,
well,
like all over the UK's done it.
well, well. First of all, there are established commuter rail lines that connect the cities in the north, right, where they're closer, like New England, where you have closer. I mean, people regularly take the train from place to place, right? It's easy, and like when I lived in Michigan, I just hop on a train and go to Chicago. Like it was pretty awesome. It's not very expensive, and you get there and wouldn't have to park a car. There's all types of benefits to it, right? But again, that's pretty close. So when you have closer cities, they do it. Um, in the United States, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that we have, again, way further, our cities are further apart. So you're going to take less, hop on a train and go there for the weekend. Another one is that automobile companies in the United States become pretty powerful, and they do use their lobbying power to discourage municipalities from developing public transportation. I mean, almost every city had streetcars, by the turn of the century. Like Nashville had streetcars. Streetcars ran all over the city. In fact, like where I live right off Riverside Drive here in Nashville, like right where Eastland and Riverside, you know where this is, in East Nashville. If you go down Riverside Drive, you see there's this, in a lot of cities actually, there's that beautiful tree lined thing in the middle of the street, right? It's grass. And you're just like, well, that's nice. In a lot of places, that's where the trolley lines used to be. And we had them. We had streetcars, I mean, all types of things. But for various reasons, the United States, the decision makers decided to go with building roads instead of building train lines. And there's reasons for that in some places, right? Some people are like, it's all a conspiracy. Don't get me wrong, lobbyists lobby, right? And General Motors is the most powerful corporation in the world for over 30 years. Certainly they have some influence on that. But at the same time, there's benefits to having a car, right? When you have a lot of space, it allows you to go different places, right? And especially once we get the interstate system, which we build up, it leads to a lot of autonomy that people tend to like. Although if you've never been in a place without with really good public transportation, then I think people think it's different than it is. I lived in Moscow for like 2 years, and I've never seen public transportation better than that. Oh my God, you don't wait more than 2.5 minutes. Like if they have a timer above the train, like in the metro, if it hits 3 minutes, something's wrong. Trains just constantly come and come and come. It's beautiful. It's also fun. I mean, one of the reasons I got to travel so much was because you can buy a Eurail pass, or you could at the time. You drop like $150, and you can ride unlimited trains across Europe, for a month. And so, it has its benefits. But again, the distance between even Athens and London is nothing compared to the distance between New York and LA. So, yeah. But we do use train lines, right? And one of the decisions we made was that we were going to prioritize commerce over actual people moving, right? As a matter of fact, as I'm saying this, I hear the horn on the train blowing on the track that runs through East Nashville here. And I hear it at night too. It's too loud. It's confusing to me because at the point that it crosses past our house, it's not going across any roads for quite a while. In fact, it's going over that giant bridge. You guys know this on East Nashville, this old bridge that was built 100 years ago. There's no roads that it's crossing there. And for that very reason, we call it the D train around here. We call it the D train because there's nothing it's crossing there, and yet it blows its horn so hard that on the other side of a hill, it would set off Solomon's baby monitor whenever he had one of those. It was insane. So that's another story.
Yeah, I had a friend who lived right next to the rail you're talking about. Like, it was like their backyard, a fence, the track. It was super loud.
Yeah, well, they're the people that have lived near those. Traditionally, it's been, if you don't have as much money, you live near those. Not in East Nashville now. I mean, they're like people who, like, you walk out your backyard and it's like, don't sit on the handrail. Mama might lose a hand if she reaches out too far there on those tracks. But me and Solomon go walk those tracks all the time. Like, it's one of our things. We go walk and see how far we can balance on the track. I'm so much better than him. He's so bad at it. I'm like, who's the big dog now, kid? Anyway, yeah, but there's constant commerce, right? And this is the thing, our ports connect to the railroad lines. And, if you ever get, and this is a nerd thing, me and my wife talk about this, I think it's like unique to us, but if you ever get out to LA, you can go on tours. The two largest ports, I believe, in the United States are right beside each other. It's the Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach. My wife's from Long Beach. So you can go on a tour of it. Good gracious. They'll take you on a boat and you'll be like in this, like what looks like a decent sized boat, right? Just riding around, and you get pull up next to one of these tankers, man, one of these freight transports. Dude, it's like the Death Star, man. Like, you can't believe how huge it is. And there are tons of them. And then you look out on the horizon. This is something you don't really see if you're from this part of the world, because, we don't have these massive ports. Like Charleston is a port, but it's not like this. But you go out to LA and you look out at the ocean and you see, I mean, just especially down towards Long Beach, because it's the southern end of LA where all these ships come in. You look out there and you just see them lined up on the horizon, and they're just waiting. And they connect to rail lines right there, and that's where they come in. And containerization, right? They just take, if you look at trains now, that radically transformed the way we transport things. Is instead of unloading things by hand, they started making containers that could sit on the structures of 18-wheeler beds. And so they just pull them off on cranes, put them on 18-wheelers, and there's constantly just a line of 18-wheelers pulling out of there as well. It's amazing that we figured this out. I mean, dude, I'm just telling you guys, it's like, well, we didn't have a train line that went to San Francisco. And they were like, let's build one. And then look at 1890. The technology, I mean, it's amazing. It's a testament to human accomplishment. It's coordination. So we get these. But everywhere that the train line goes means that people can live there now. And not only that, what you see in all of this is that the U.S. government actually sponsors this. Transcontinental Railroad was passed through Congress. And one of the things they do to encourage people to build more railroad lines out west is they give land grants to the railroad companies. So they'll give them a stretch of acreage on one side, and then it goes on the other side, and then it goes on the other side, right? So it's kind of like staggered places, right? But they give them land so that they can have, they, ostensibly, I think to give them, places to set up stations for repairs and everything. But they get this land, and the railroad companies want to sell it to settlers, people looking to go west. So they have a profit incentive to get people to move out there. I just learned this last night from a historian, University of Albany, wrote a book about the telegraph, and the way that a lot of these companies would work, the telegraph and the railroad companies, was they needed to raise a ton of money to build these things. It was very expensive. And so one of the things they would do was they would go to like established towns, kind of like on the cusp of the railroad, and they would tell the people there, hey, do you guys want to buy some stock in our railroad? If you don't, we will bypass your city. Which I don't know if you've seen what happens to places that used to be roads that got passed by interstates, Route 66. But when a major hub of transportation just even goes a mile in the other direction, the rot sets in. But at this time, you're pushing people out there. And railroad companies are advertising to Americans who are living in the East going, go west, because they can sell this land to them. And particularly in places where if you start from the west and you catty-corner, you kind of stagger the sides, you come from the east and you stagger the sides, eventually you'll hit places where you own all of the land on both sides. And that's a place to really push for. Great article by Kate Brown, who's a historian, University of Maryland, Baltimore. It's called Gridded Lives. She writes great books that compare the U.S. and Russia in ways that you wouldn't expect. And one of the things she talks about in this is railroad companies. They're pushed to sell land in the middle of Montana. And the way that they sell that land to people in the East is utterly dishonest. Remember, at this time, there's no, I want to see the photographs of it. Okay, can we look at Google Maps and check it out? You got no clue. Somebody just goes, oh my God, we got some beautiful land in Montana. It's a lot like an oasis out there. Great farmland. And you buy it, and then you buy the train ticket on the train line, and you get out there, and you spent your whole life savings to finally get some land out west, just like you heard of, and you get dropped off in a bog in Montana. And you got no way to get back. It happens to a lot of people. It's actually, you guys know the Donner Party? You guys ever heard of the Donner Party? The people that get stuck in the Sierra Nevada mountains and then eat each other? Yeah. So they're part of the same kind of scam. Come out, buy this land. Don't go buy land up in Oregon or Northern California. We know a shortcut to get to this even better land that nobody's bought yet. We'll sell it to you at a discount. Turns out the guy did not know a shortcut. He just heard about it. People get stuck in this pass and, well, they eat each other. By the way, the lesson of the Donner Party is that you never know when you're going to be in a situation where you need to eat people, particularly loved ones. So you might want to have that conversation. Have that conversation. Hey, if we get stuck in a pass, it's cool if you eat me. And ladies, you be the winners, trust me, because women tend to have overall higher body fat indexes. And so it's more likely the guys are going to die first and, bon appetit. All right.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
How did we go from talking about railroads to cannibalism just like so fast?
The beauty of American history.
Because what I'm saying is the railroad companies, they're incentivized to sell this land to people who go out west. But the railroad companies also are the only ones who have any information about what is actually happening out there, so they can lie to people. And they scam people into buying this land sometimes by totally lying to them about what's out there. And the people that buy it, they're not buying, they're buying it because it's a discount. It's their opportunity to get land, right? But when they get out there, they find out that it is not at all what they expected. And a lot of them lose everything. And a lot of them are just forced to live through this hell that is trying to grow things they thought they could grow out in Montana. What I'm saying is that wasn't a new thing with the railroads. There were actually land speculators out west that had done that before, even before the railroads. And the Donner Party was one of them. They're part of this story. And it actually starts with American colonization, dude. You should read the stuff that the promoters of like Roanoke colony said were there. They're like, oh, it's beautiful out there. You can grow all types of crops. It's just tons of money out there. And the problem was at the point they were writing this in the 1580s, there had already been Americans who went over there, and a lot of them died, and they forced their way back on the boat. And they were like, do not go there. It is horrible. But the people who were trying to make money off of it were like, don't listen to them. They're just mad. They didn't try to grow all these beautiful crops you can grow out there, and maybe there's gold. It's a long history of lying to people who can't possibly know the truth to make money. And a couple of American colonies, even in the 16th, 17th century, are doing the same thing. That's why you never buy land on Craigslist without there being a picture. And you think this was a 19th century thing, you're going to be blown away by the number of people who are buying waterfront land in Florida in towns that do not exist in the 1920s, thus creating a speculative bubble around Florida land that precedes the Great Depression by just a couple years. Nobody learned from it. AMC. GameStop. Okay, so, as it turns out, supply and demand does not always match the actual value of something. Price and value are two different things. So in this, you push Americans into the middle of the country. They're settling there in places they never had settled before, all in a very short burst. And in doing this, you create all types of amazing things. First of all, time zones. You guys know about time zones? I'm confused as to why we're in the central time zone in Nashville. Wish that we were on the East. I'm actually not confused about it. I'm just angry about it. I wish that we were on the Eastern Standard Time. But you know why we are. It's because time zones have everything to do with commerce, and they're set up in the 19th century, the late 19th century, because now, for the first time, people are moving such large distances. They need to coordinate over time. So instead of having your local clock or whatever, or you decide what it is locally, you need to know when a train is going to show up in your town. So you need a uniform time system that can give you an idea of that, right? As commerce moves, you've got to have a sense of time. Most Americans don't even think in terms of time prior to the Industrial Revolution because farmers just get up in the morning and go to work when the sun's up. Right? Anybody who knows any farmers, they get up and they work when the day starts and they work until they're done or they can't work anymore. And talking about 11 o'clock, we're going to milk the cows. No, you milk the cows when you can get to it. But then the factory, because factories need to have regimented time structures, they introduce the time structure to people's lives with the bell because they need everyone to be there at the exact same time. They're not bound by nature in the same way that farming is. And so you get time, but then you need to coordinate. This is why to this day, if you deal with time zones, federal time zones are set by states can change them, but what actually is the final say-so is appealing to the U.S. Department of Commerce. That's who oversees our time zones. Because it was set by them, because that was the fundamental reason for the time zones, was the need to coordinate commerce. But when people go out west, it is amazing. You guys ever know all those stories about the Wild West and all that stuff? All craziness out there. Those are a little bit Hollywood, actually a lot Hollywood. But the West is nuts. There is no more intense and uncertain and dangerous a situation as when you end up with roving bands of single young men who got nothing to lose. And that is mining. People who go out to mine, and it starts with San Francisco in the United States. People go out to San Francisco to mine. Actually, it starts in Roanoke. It all starts way back then. You send a bunch of men somewhere and you're like, get us some stuff out of the ground. And you don't have to be there for long because you're not growing it. Just go find it and get rich fast. It'll be awesome. And all these single dudes just trying to get rich quick, got no long-term plans to be there. They create nightmares for everyone who's around there. Fighting, right? Brothels follow all of that. Drinking. And that's what it is. Well, out west, these railroads, the people that are investors in that, are also looking for places they can find resources. So they use these railroads and they go through these places. And extractive industries are not long-term in a lot of places. You might find a place that has a ton of gold, you get it out of the ground and you move on. This explains all those ghost towns out west. Have you ever been out west and driven through you guys ever been driven out west, like through New Mexico? You guys ever done that? Yeah, there's all these ghost towns out there. It doesn't make sense to us around here because we don't have that most of the time. But out there, yeah, it's because you set up a town, there'd be some gold or some silver in the ground, you would mine it, it would create a boom, you'd build a city, and then when it was gone, the whole entire reason that place was there was gone, and then you pack up and you move on. But the earlier version of that are these moving towns. They're referred to as hells on wheels. These towns that these railroad companies will pack up on a train, move to a place, set up. It is intense. The work is dangerous as hell. But you attract people by paying decent. They move around. They got no reason to stay there. It is amazing. You have lawless towns because what are you going to do? Get a city council together? We're going to be here for a year. And the law, a lot of times, is set by the mining companies. We'll get into this later. The mining companies will, once they even set up towns that are going to be permanent, they own the towns by and large, and they have their own private armies. So if you don't want to go to work, guess what? Here's about 40 Pinkertons with guns. They say you're going to work. And that gets real interesting because you send the miners to work with dynamite to blast holes in things. Sometimes, after having the Pinkertons point guns at you for a while, you start smuggling a little bit of dynamite out of the mine every day, and then one day the former governor of Idaho's house explodes. That's a true story. There are straight up wars out in these towns. I mean, I'm not talking about, oh, it was a war. I'm talking about people shooting each other full on, armed miners, armies meeting up with Pinkerton shootouts, people dying, things exploding. It's nuts. But in all of this, what gets left out of these stories is the fact that the Native Americans who've been pushed west, those who have actually lived out there anyway, they are seeing in these maps that I showed you here, they are seeing a new wave of encroachment upon their land and their way of life. Not surprising, a complete disregard for their lives and their right to property, which they had seen since the Europeans arrived, leads to an attempt to stop this onslaught. Once again, the federal government sometimes promising things they don't deliver on, other times simply trying to eliminate the people there. And this goes back. What happens to the Native Americans around San Francisco has been described by some scholars as a full-on genocide, because there is a deliberate attempt to eliminate the Native American population around there. Now, I can't make that argument because I'm not an expert in that field, but I can tell you that I've read the arguments, and as someone who has read them, I think there's a case to be made for it. Again, as I said this in History 2010, history is written by the winners. I can't help but wonder if the United States had lost the war and been forced to face up with its past in the same way that other countries have. What a museum to the treatment of the Native Americans would look like. It wasn't the Germans who decided they wanted to go face to face with what they did in the Holocaust. It was that the other countries of the world decided they were going to be forced to see it, so that they couldn't deny it. There's an intensive effort after World War II by the U.S. and the British to walk German citizens through concentration camps so that they cannot deny that it happened. I'm not saying that ours would necessarily look the same way, but I think being confronted all at once with the reality of this certainly looked different if we didn't get to tell the story ourselves. So you see already, and one of the problems is that the Native Americans have rights to lands collectively. Tribal lands are collectively owned. They're not individually owned. Well, that's a problem because you guys know the thing whenever there's a poor part of town and somebody wants to build a stadium there, for example, what you do is you move in on each person individually and you say, hey, I'll give you this money for it. Once the first couple of them sell, their houses are going to get torn down, which is going to make things harder on other people, which means that other people go, okay, I guess we got to sell. But when people collectively make that decision, they all can say at the same time, no, we don't want to sell. So in 1787, the Dawes Act, passed by the federal government, eliminates the tribal collective lands and has a lot of the reservations portioned up into individual portions so that, guess what? You can now move on them and offer individually prices. And without an ability to coordinate in the same way, it becomes more difficult to hold out. Over this, in the next 50 years after this, Native Americans are going to lose 86 of 138 million acres of land. But on top of that, the Native Americans aren't going to take it. And this happens over and over again in American history. After a period of trying to negotiate to secure their rights, eventually they realize that that's not going to work. They turn towards armed action. 1890, there's a Wounded Knee Massacre. And over the next several years, what's going to happen is the federal policy is going to be aimed at assimilating Native Americans into the American way of life. Stop thinking about yourselves as a group. Think about yourselves as individuals. We know how to deal with you if you're an individual. Harder when you're a collective. And in these wars, again, you're going to see former Confederate soldiers fighting with Union soldiers, Northerners and Southerners fighting together. The unity of the country, at least one major source of it, just as before, comes at the expense of our first citizens, Native Americans. And that story continues. I just saw a story today that the Navajo Indians are one of the hardest communities hit by COVID right now. Because of lack of resources. But if we're silent about them in the past, it's a lot easier to be silent about them in the present. If you are just an individual making bad choices on the basis of your life, well, then we can wash our hands of it, right? Hey, man, should have made better decisions. But if the conditions that you are born into have set you a much harder path, well, then maybe there's a reason to think about those conditions, what was done to create those conditions. Maybe you feel a little more empathy. Empathy is a dangerous thing. When we can look each other in the eyes as individuals who have our unique experiences, it's real hard to hate us. You start to get that love. You feel that love for somebody. You ever wonder why people spend so much time trying to tell you that you're fundamentally different from another group of people? You should know that it's really hard to look a person in the eye, think about them as a father or a mother, think about them as someone who has the same hopes and insecurities as you. It's real hard to treat that person bad. But if I can tell you they deserve it, or I can tell you, don't even talk to them. Don't listen to them. They're just bad. They're going to make excuses. If I can keep you from talking to them, ways that we can justify injustice around us. That's why, again, the silence sometimes is as powerful as the noise. In the next class, we'll get into more industrial innovations and how they change the way people communicate and live. Have a great day. Thank you for being here.